Okay, to pick back up where we left off, um, over the years of Spanish exploration, they continued to search and search for, the lost gold and silver and treasures and whatnot that they were convinced were hidden somewhere, in North America. But over time, as each expedition, explored and explored, and money was expended in supplies and pay for the soldiers, when they kept coming up empty-handed, they began to just kind of lose faith. They began to, decide that it wasn't worth the expenditure. It wasn't worth spending the money to try to find out what was there. They didn't think that there was really anything for them. Okay, most that Coronado reported was that there was some good farmland, but basically not much else. There were some hostile natives, and not much else. So, why did Spain lose interest in the Texas area, especially in the Panhandle? They lost interest because they never found anything. They didn't find what they were looking for. They were mainly interested in gold and silver and the lost, treasures of the church that had supposedly been hidden in this land. What do you think might cause Spain to regain interest? Could it be if someone else comes sniffing around? As it so happens, the French were the next on the scene. Okay, Spain had found some wealth and some prosperity. They had set up colonies, right? They were importing different spices and foods and whatnot. They were importing some gold and silver that had been found. So the French wanted a piece of that action. And so they were looking for a shortcut across the continent. They were hoping to be able to just sail through, somehow find a river that could take them quickly through the interior of the continent of North America. And so they first started exploring and settling and colonizing Canada, up north. And they had established a fur trade that was very lucrative, very successful. And so along came an explorer named René Robert Cavelier de la Salle, shortened to de la Salle. And he traveled down the Mississippi River from Canada. The Mississippi River runs all the way from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. And so he traveled down the Mississippi, hoping that it would be the shortcut to take him across the continent. It wasn't. But he did discover a lot of other things. But he had plans to establish a French presence in the southern part of the continent. So whenever he landed, he would claim that land for France. So basically, all along the river, he claimed that land for France. And so he claimed the entire area along the Mississippi River. He called it Louisiana, after King Louis. And so he went back to France to get more men to implement the next part of his plan. And so in 1685, this is a while after the Spanish. If you remember, Coronado and all the other explorers, these are like in the 1520s to 1530s and 40s. So really 140 years later, the area had been kind of left alone. There wasn't much there wasn't any Spanish exploration, hardly at all. The French were just now coming onto the scene in that part of the continent. And so there was a lull, a quiet period of about 140 years. And so now, La Salle's on the scene, and he's back. He's come back from France, and he heads back to the mouth of the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico. And his plan was to build a fort at the mouth of the Mississippi River. But he got caught up in a storm in the Gulf of Mexico, and he shipwrecked in Texas. A place called like Matagorda Bay. There's an artist's depiction of him landing in Texas with and meeting the Karankawa Indians. What was the shortcut that France was looking for in North America? The shortcut was a way to take them across the continent. What was one success that France found in the New World? I mean, it could be claiming that entire swath of land in the center of the continent. It could be the fur trade that was very lucrative. They made a lot of money off the fur trade. So ultimately, though, La Salle failed in what he was attempting to do. He shipwrecked near Matagorda Bay, Texas. They quickly built a fort and used it to protect themselves from the Karankawa. The Karankawa were not happy that the French were there. And so La Salle set out. He was convinced that he was so close to the Mississippi River, but he had no idea that he was, 200-300 miles away from it. And so on one of his trips, he suffered a mutiny, a revolt by his soldiers, and his soldiers killed him. He was killed by his own men in a mutiny. And shortly after that, Fort St. Louis was destroyed in an attack by the Karankawa. The natives, they took five prisoners and killed the rest of the French settlers. Later on the site of old Fort St. Louis was a mission that we'll study called La Bahia. So who was the French explorer who accidentally crashed into Texas and claimed part of it for France? The answer was De La Salle. La Salle. What happened to his settlements and what happened to him? If you remember, he was killed by his own men, and his settlement and his fort was destroyed by the Karankawa. And here's just a little wrap up of La Salle. You can see in the map where there is Matagorda Bay. His ship was called La Belle, and there is actually, the nearest town is called Port Lavaca, but there is actually a La Salle County down in South Texas named after De La Salle. So the reaction of Spain to all this, all of a sudden, Spain had done nothing with the land. They had just left it alone. They didn't have any interest for them. It cost too much money to try to do anything with it, but now they've heard about France has started to sneak in and try to take over. So Spain has already claimed all of that land for themselves. And so now France is coming to sniff in and try to take it out from underneath them. So all of a sudden, Spain has decided, they have to decide to try to spend, they've got to start spending money, build military forts, and so they needed to reassert their control. And so from that point on, Spain began to expend money, time, money, and energy to build settlements in the New World. They called it New Spain in order to stake that claim. And so, because essentially possession is 9/10 the law. I mean, you have to have people living in an area that are loyal to you in order to keep another nation from taking the land from underneath you. That's why our government today, the United States government, they pay people, they will pay you to live in Alaska, especially on the frontier. Because the more people that they can have Americans living in Alaska, the less likely it is that a country like, say, Russia can start creeping in and taking over land out from underneath us. So how did Spain react when they learned that France had arrived in their part of the New World? Obviously, they were not happy about it, right? So they decided they needed to start spending some time and money to establish a presence. They needed a presence in that land in order to discourage and deter other countries trying to move in. So here is a wrap-up, a quick wrap-up of our early explorers of Texas. Christopher Columbus never really discovered, or he discovered North and South America. He never actually set foot in Texas, but it was his discoveries that set off the race, set off the horse race to colonize the New World. Cortez, he conquered the Aztecs, and he built Mexico City in 1519. That's the important date for Cortez. That's when he conquered Tenochtitlan, and built Mexico City on top of the ruins. Right about the same year, Alvarez de Pineda, he mapped the coastline of Texas while he was sailing along in the Gulf of Mexico, looking for a shortcut to the Pacific Ocean. The next guy, Cabeza de Vaca, he was part of an earlier expedition, but he was shipwrecked. But he was the first Spaniard to actually enter what is now Texas proper, and he kept a journal of his life in Texas called La Relación. Coronado, he searched for Cibola, the 7 cities of gold and silver. That was the entire point of his journey. It took him through Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, all the way up into Kansas. But he failed to find any gold or silver. And La Salle, to summarize him, he set up a failed French colony in 1685 in Matagorda Bay, Texas, down along the coast called Fort St. Louis. And that's going to be all we've got for today. And tomorrow we'll start on some review for the next test.